The voicemail wasn't meant for me. That single fact changed everything I thought I knew about my life, my grief, and the daughter-in-law I had welcomed into our family with open arms. I was standing in my kitchen in Portland, sorting through Marcus's belongings 3 years after his funeral, when I accidentally hit play on an old phone tucked in a box of his personal effects. The voice that emerged made my blood run cold. It was Marcus, my dead husband, leaving a message for someone named Claire, confirming their usual meeting spot for Thursday afternoon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The phone slipped from my hands and clattered against the granite countertop. For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. 3 years of grief, of slowly rebuilding my life after losing the man I'd loved for 32 years. And now this impossible recording pulling me back into a nightmare I thought had ended. I picked up the phone with trembling fingers and played the message again. This time listening with the analytical precision that had once made me one of the top forensic accountants in the Pacific Northwest. Marcus's voice was unmistakable. That slight rasp he developed after his supposed heart attack. The way he pronounced certain words with the faint Boston accent, he never quite lost despite decades in Oregon. But it was the date stamp that truly shattered my reality. The message was dated 6 months ago. 6 months after I had stood at his graveside, clutching a folded flag, listening to a chaplain speak about sacrifice and loss. My legs gave out and I found myself sitting on the kitchen floor, back pressed against the cabinet where Marcus used to keep his collection of vintage whiskeys. The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my hands. I scrolled through the call history, each entry a fresh wound. Dozens of calls. Hundreds, actually. All to and from a number saved simply as C. The calls stretched back years, some dating to before Marcus's death, but many impossibly occurring after. I knew I should call someone. My son Derek. The police. Anyone. But something held me back. Maybe it was the decades I'd spent investigating financial fraud, following paper trails that revealed uncomfortable truths about people everyone trusted. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was the sudden creeping certainty that if I moved too quickly, whatever web of lies I'd stumbled into would collapse before I could understand its full scope. Instead, I sat on that kitchen floor and methodically went through every piece of information on the phone. Text messages, sparse but revealing. Calendar appointments at addresses I didn't recognize. Photos that made my heart constrict, showing Marcus alive and well, sometimes with a woman whose face I couldn't quite make out in the distance shots. And then I found it. A contact entry that made everything else pale in comparison. The number saved as C belonged to Claire Morrison, my daughter-in-law. The Claire who had married my son Derek 5 years ago in a ceremony I'd helped plan. The Claire who had held my hand at Marcus's funeral, tears streaming down her face as she told me she couldn't imagine how much pain I must be in. The Claire who came to dinner every Sunday, who called me mom, who had become like the daughter I never had. That Claire had been meeting with my supposedly dead husband for years. I forced myself to breathe, to think, to approach this like I would any complex fraud case. Start with what you know, establish a timeline, identify the inconsistencies. I pulled myself up from the floor and retrieved my laptop, then spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing dates, creating spreadsheets, mapping out patterns. By the time darkness fell outside my kitchen windows, I had constructed a narrative that was both impossible and undeniable. Marcus's heart attack had occurred during a business trip to Seattle, or so I'd been told. I was in Chicago at the time, finishing up testimony in a federal fraud case that had consumed 18 months of my life. Derek had been the one to call me, his voice shattered, telling me Dad was gone. I'd flown home immediately, numb with shock. The funeral arrangements had already been started by the time I arrived. Claire had been incredibly helpful, taking charge of so many details while Derek struggled with his grief. Now, looking back with new eyes, I saw the architecture of deception everywhere. The closed casket funeral, which Derek had insisted upon because of the trauma of the heart attack. The cremation that happened so quickly, before I'd even fully processed what had happened. The way Claire had been the one to handle so many of the administrative details, the death certificate, the insurance claims, the notifications to various agencies. I pulled up the death certificate on my computer. I'd filed it away digitally, part of the overwhelming paperwork that follows any death. As a forensic accountant, I'd spent my career spotting anomalies in documentation, and now I examined this certificate with professional scrutiny. The signature of the attending physician was barely legible, standard for doctors. The hospital listed was Swedish Medical Center in Seattle. The cause of death was acute myocardial infarction. Everything appeared legitimate. But was it? Could someone fake a death certificate? In my line of work, I'd seen people fake everything else. Tax returns, bank statements, audit reports. Why not this? The thought felt like falling, like the ground beneath me had turned to water. If Marcus was alive, if he had staged his own death, then nothing about the last 3 years was real. Every moment of grief, every tear I'd shed, every painful step toward healing had been built on a foundation of lies. The question was why? And more pressingly, who else knew? I stood and began pacing my kitchen, the same kitchen where Marcus and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd argued about renovations and laughed over inside jokes, where he'd held me after my mother died and promised we'd face everything together. The familiarity of the space felt like mockery now. How many of those moments had been real? When had the lies begun? My phone, my actual phone, buzzed with an incoming text. It was Claire. "Hi, Mom. Just confirming Sunday dinner at your place. Derek and I are bringing dessert. Love you." The casual affection in her message felt like acid. I stared at those words, "love you," and felt something harden inside my chest. Whatever game was being played, I was done being a piece on someone else's board. I'd spent 30 years unraveling financial conspiracies, following money trails through shell corporations and offshore accounts, exposing fraud that people thought they buried too deep to find. This was just another investigation, a more personal one certainly, but I had tools and skills most people never developed. I typed back a response. "Looking forward to it, sweetheart. See you then." Sunday was 4 days away. That gave me time to gather information, to confirm what I already suspected, to build a case. Because that's what this was now. A case. And I intended to solve it before I confronted anyone. In my experience, people could lie convincingly when they didn't know you had evidence. But confronted with undeniable proof, even the best liars crumbled. I turned my attention back to Marcus's phone, specifically to the calendar function. The appointments were cryptic but followed patterns. Every Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, there was an entry that said simply usual place. Every first Saturday of the month, another entry, just the letter C. I pulled up a map and started investigating the locations associated with some of the earlier, more specific entries before they'd gotten careful about leaving digital trails. One address appeared repeatedly in the older messages. A coffee shop called the Riverside Roast in Lake Oswego, about 20 minutes from my house. I knew the place vaguely, had probably driven past it 100 times without really noticing. According to the timestamps, Marcus and Claire had been meeting there regularly, usually mid-afternoon on weekdays when Derek would be at his architectural firm and I would typically be at work. Except I wasn't working anymore. I'd retired 8 months ago, finally stepping away from the consulting firm I'd built over 3 decades. The decision had been partly financial. I'd done well for myself and had more than enough saved. But mostly it had been emotional. After Marcus died, I'd thrown myself into work, using investigation and analysis as a balm against grief. Eventually, I'd realized I was just exhausting myself, running from feelings rather than processing them. So I'd retired, thinking I'd use the time to heal, to travel, to finally read all those books stacked on my nightstand. Instead, I'd spent 8 months in a fog of well-meaning but hollow existence. Brunch with friends who didn't know what to say to a widow. Volunteering at the community center. Reorganizing closets. Going through Marcus's things at a pace that felt both too fast and impossibly slow. That's what I'd been doing when I found the phone, finally packing up his home office, a task I'd been avoiding for 3 years. Now I understood why some part of me had resisted that task. Some subconscious instinct had known there were secrets hiding in that room, truths I wasn't ready to face. But ready or not, here they were demanding attention. I made myself eat something though food tasted like cardboard. Then I sat down and did what I'd always done when facing a complex investigation. I made a plan. First, verify that Marcus was actually alive. The phone messages could be elaborate fakes, though my professional judgment said they weren't. The metadata looked legitimate, the voice analysis seemed right. But I needed visual confirmation. Second, understand the scope of the conspiracy. Who else was involved? Just Claire, or were there others? What about Derek? The thought of my son being part of this made me physically ill, but I couldn't rule it out. Third, determine the motive. Why would Marcus fake his death? Why would Claire help him? What did they gain from this elaborate deception? And finally, decide what to do with the information once I had it. That was the step I kept pushing away, the question I wasn't ready to answer. Because depending on what I discovered, my next move could destroy what remained of my family. I spent Tuesday conducting surveillance, a skill I'd picked up working alongside private investigators on fraud cases. The Riverside Roast had outdoor seating with a good view of the entrance. I positioned myself at a bus stop across the street with a clear sight line, wearing sunglasses and a hat I'd bought specifically for this purpose, feeling ridiculous and determined in equal measure.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
At 1:45, Claire's silver Audi pulled into the parking lot. I watched her emerge, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, looking exactly like the woman who'd become part of our family. She glanced at her phone, then entered the coffee shop. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. 15 minutes passed. I was beginning to think I'd misunderstood, that maybe this was innocent, maybe Claire just liked this particular coffee shop. Then a man approached from the opposite direction, walking rather than driving. He wore a baseball cap and kept his head down, but I recognized the gait immediately. 32 years of marriage teaches you someone's walk, the particular way they carry their weight, the rhythm of their stride. Marcus was alive. He entered the coffee shop and through the front window, I saw him approach Claire's table. She stood and they embraced. Not the hug of acquaintances or even friends. Something closer, more intimate. They sat down across from each other, and I watched them talk, their body language speaking volumes. Claire reached across the table at one point and put her hand over his. He smiled at her, the same smile I'd seen thousands of times, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I took photos with my phone, dozens of them, documentation for the case I was building. Then I did something that felt both invasive and entirely justified. I opened a voice recording app and crossed the street, entering the coffee shop as quietly as possible. I ordered at the counter, then positioned myself at a table behind a dividing wall where I could hear their conversation but remain out of direct sight. Their voices drifted over clearly. Claire was talking about Derek, my son, her husband. He's been stressed about the Henderson project. Working late most nights. That's good, Marcus replied. Keeps him occupied. Have you had any problems with the transfers? None. Everything's moving through the channels we set up. Your wife hasn't noticed anything. Your wife. Not Vivian. Not even she or her. Your wife, as if I were a stranger. An obstacle to be managed rather than a person who'd loved him for 3 decades. She won't, Marcus said with certainty. Vivian's smart, brilliant actually, but she's been in retirement mode. Not paying attention to the details like she used to. And she trusts you completely. That was always the key to this working. I felt like I'd been stabbed. The casual way he discussed my trust, my diminished attention, as if I were a security system they'd successfully bypassed. Claire laughed at something he said. A sound that felt profoundly wrong coming from someone who'd stood beside me at what I thought was this man's funeral. They talked for another 20 minutes, discussing logistics I didn't fully understand yet, mentioning account numbers and transfer dates. Then Claire glanced at her watch. I should go. Sunday dinner at your wife's place, remember? How is she doing? Marcus asked, and something in his tone almost sounded like genuine concern. Better, actually. She seems lighter lately. I think retirement is helping her heal. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. I was healing from grief they had manufactured, moving on from a death that never happened, while they discussed me like I was a problem that had been successfully contained. After they left separately, Claire first and Marcus 10 minutes later, I remained in the coffee shop, my untouched latte growing cold in front of me. I needed to understand the financial angle. Marcus had mentioned transfers, accounts, channels. In my experience, when people fake deaths, it was usually about money. Insurance fraud was the obvious answer. But I'd handled Marcus's life insurance myself. A modest policy that had paid out without issue. So what was the real game? I drove home and went straight to my office, the room where I'd spent countless hours building my career, analyzing financial statements, constructing cases that sent white-collar criminals to prison. Now I turned those same skills on my own life. I pulled up every account, every investment, every financial record I could access. Marcus's death had resulted in various financial changes. His retirement accounts had transferred to me as beneficiary. Joint accounts had become solely mine. The house, already in both our names, had been refinanced under just my name to get a better rate. Then I started looking at the records with fresh eyes, searching for the patterns I'd been trained to spot. And there they were, subtle but present once you knew to look. Small transfers, never large enough to trigger alerts, moving from accounts into what appeared to be legitimate business expenses or investments. Over 3 years, the amounts added up to substantial sums. Someone had been systematically siphoning money from accounts I controlled, doing it so skillfully that I, a forensic accountant, hadn't noticed. The anger that washed over me was cleaner than the grief, sharper and more useful. This wasn't just about a fake death. This was about theft. Marcus and Claire, and possibly others, had been stealing from me, using my grief and trust as cover for a long-term financial fraud. I spent the rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday documenting everything. I created a forensic timeline, the kind I'd once presented in courtrooms, showing the flow of money, the pattern of meetings, the construction of lies. I verified the authenticity of every piece of evidence, knowing that when I finally made my move it would need to be airtight. Thursday afternoon I did something reckless. I went to the Riverside roast again, not to observe but to confront. I timed my arrival for exactly 2 o'clock, their usual meeting time. Sure enough, Claire was already there, and Marcus arrived minutes later. This time I didn't hide. I walked directly to their table and sat down in the empty chair. The expressions on their faces would have been comical if the situation weren't so devastating. Claire went white, her hand freezing halfway to her coffee cup. Marcus's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like he might run. But he'd always had nerve, my husband. He recovered quickly, his face settling into an expression I didn't recognize. Calculation mixed with something like resignation. "Hello, Marcus," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "You're looking well for a dead man." Claire made a small sound, almost a whimper. She looked at Marcus, then at me, trapped and terrified. Good. They should be terrified. I'd spent 3 years grieving a man who'd been alive the whole time, who'd chosen to let me suffer while he pursued whatever selfish agenda had motivated this elaborate deception. "Vivian," Marcus began, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "I don't want to hear explanations or excuses right now. What I want is very simple. Both of you are going to remain seated while I say what I need to say. If either of you tries to leave, I'll call the police immediately. I have evidence of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Enough to put you both in prison for years. So sit, listen, and then we'll discuss how this is going to end." They sat, and I began to explain exactly what I discovered, watching their faces as I laid out the case against them, piece by irrefutable piece. The forensic accountant in me took satisfaction in their growing horror, as they realized how thoroughly I documented their crimes. But the wife, the mother-in-law, the woman who'd been betrayed by the 2 people she'd trusted most, that part of me was already preparing for the much harder confrontation that would come on Sunday. Because I still didn't know the full scope of this conspiracy. And I still didn't know if my son Derek was part of it or another victim like me. That answer would determine everything that came next, including whether I destroyed my entire family to pursue justice, or found some other path through this nightmare. The coffee shop conversation lasted an hour. Marcus tried several strategies, charm, defensiveness, attempted justifications, but I'd spent 30 years dealing with financial criminals. I knew every deflection, every manipulation tactic. I simply waited him out, letting him exhaust his repertoire while I gathered more information from what he said and what he carefully didn't say. Claire was easier to read. She was terrified and clearly hadn't anticipated getting caught. Her tells were obvious to someone trained in reading people during interrogations. When Marcus mentioned Derek, Claire's eyes darted away. When he talked about the financial arrangements, her hands trembled slightly. She was involved, but she wasn't the architect of this scheme. That was Marcus, always Marcus. "Why?" I finally asked, cutting through Marcus's latest attempt to minimize what they'd done. That's what I don't understand. We had a good life. A solid marriage, or so I thought. Financial security. A son we both loved. What was worth destroying all of that? Marcus looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. For the first time since I'd sat down, I saw something that might have been genuine emotion beneath the calculated facade. It wasn't supposed to hurt you, he said quietly. That was never the goal. Then what was the goal, Marcus? Help me understand how faking your death and stealing from me for 3 years wasn't designed to hurt me. He exhaled slowly, and I recognized the gesture. It was what he did when he was about to tell a difficult truth, back when I believed he was capable of truth. I made mistakes, Vivian. Financial mistakes years ago. Investments that went bad, debts I couldn't cover. I was desperate, drowning, and I didn't know how to tell you. You were always so competent, so successful. I felt like a failure next to you. The words hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to scoff, to point out that feeling inadequate didn't justify 3 years of elaborate fraud. But another part, the part that had loved this man for 3 decades, recognized the pain behind his admission. I'd known about his insecurity, though I'd never understood its depth. Marcus had always been more traditional in his views about gender roles, had struggled sometimes with being married to a woman who out-earned him, whose career was more prominent than his own. So you decided to die, I said flatly. That was your solution to financial problems and wounded pride. It was more complicated than that, Claire interjected suddenly. Both Marcus and I turned to look at her, and she flinched but continued. He came to me 2 years before the fake death. He was in trouble, serious trouble. People he owed money to, dangerous people. I offered to help him. Why? I demanded, focusing on my daughter-in-law with laser intensity. Why would you help him hide from his wife, from his own son? What did you get out of this? Claire's face crumpled. He told me you were having an affair, that you were planning to leave him and take everything. He said he needed to protect himself financially, and he needed someone he could trust to help him do it. I believed him, Vivian. I swear I believed him. I looked at Marcus and saw the truth in his inability to meet my eyes. He'd lied to Claire about me, manipulated her into helping him by painting me as the villain in our marriage. It was brilliantly cruel, turning my daughter-in-law against me, using her loyalty to family as the weapon. There was no affair, I said coldly. I never cheated on Marcus, never even considered it. And I certainly wasn't planning to leave him or take anything that wasn't rightfully mine. Every word he told you was a lie designed to make you complicit in his fraud. Claire's tears started then, genuine sobs that shook her shoulders. I didn't know. By the time I realized something was wrong, I was already in too deep. The fake death certificate, the cremation arrangements, all of it. I thought I was helping save a man from an unfair divorce, but I was helping him steal from you. And you continued for 3 years, I pointed out, unmoved by her tears. Even after Marcus was supposedly dead, you kept meeting with him, kept facilitating the transfers. At what point did you realize you weren't the hero of this story, Claire? She had no answer for that, just continued crying into her hands. Marcus reached toward her, then seemed to think better of it when he saw my expression. What happens now? He asked, and there was defeat in his voice. He knew exactly how thoroughly I could destroy them both if I chose to. The evidence I'd gathered could put them away for years, could ruin their lives as completely as they tried to ruin mine. That depends, I said slowly, on several factors. First, I want complete financial transparency. Every account, every transfer, every penny that was taken from me, I want it documented and returned. Second, I want the truth about who else is involved. If Derek is part of this, I need to know now. Derek doesn't know anything, Marcus said quickly, urgently. That was the one line I wouldn't cross, Vivian. Whatever else I've done, I didn't involve our son in this. He genuinely believes I'm dead. I searched his face for deception and found what I thought was honesty. It was a small mercy, but I'd take it. The thought of Derek being part of this conspiracy had been eating at me since I discovered the truth. Third, I continued, I want to understand the full scope of this operation. You mentioned dangerous people, debts. I want names, amounts, the complete story. No more lies, Marcus. I've spent 3 years grieving a fiction. The least you owe me is the truth. Over the next hour they told me everything. Marcus had gotten involved in what he thought was a legitimate investment opportunity about 7 years ago. It turned out to be a front for money laundering, and by the time he realized what he'd gotten into, he was in deep. The people running it didn't appreciate him trying to extract himself. They wanted their money back with interest that bordered on extortion. Marcus had tried to handle it quietly, liquidating assets, borrowing from friends, anything to avoid telling me. But the debt kept growing, and eventually, the threats became serious enough that he believed his life was in danger. That's when he'd approached Claire, spun his lie about me having an affair, and recruited her to help him disappear. The plan had been for him to stay gone for a year, maybe 2, just long enough for the heat to die down. He'd established a new identity, was living quietly in a small town in eastern Oregon. Claire was supposed to slowly siphon money from accounts I controlled, amounts small enough to avoid notice, sending it to Marcus so he could eventually pay off his debts and potentially resurface. But then something unexpected happened. With Marcus gone and me in retirement, I'd started to rebuild my life. According to Claire, I seemed happier, lighter, less burdened. And Marcus, watching from a distance, realized that maybe his death had done me a favor. Maybe I was better off without him. So you just decided to stay dead? I said, the pieces clicking into place. It was easier than facing what you'd done. Easier than admitting you'd failed. That you'd gotten involved in something criminal. That you needed help. I'm sorry, Marcus said, and for the first time I believed he meant it. I know that doesn't fix anything, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I am truly deeply sorry for what I've put you through. I sat back in my chair, feeling exhausted. The anger that had sustained me through the investigation was giving way to something more complex. Grief, yes, but also relief. Relief that my son wasn't involved. Relief that I wasn't losing my mind. And strange as it was, relief that Marcus was alive, even if I could never forgive what he'd done. Here's what's going to happen, I said finally, my voice firm with the authority I'd once used in courtrooms. You're going to provide me with complete financial documentation. Every account, every transfer, everything. I'll verify it against my own records and determine exactly how much was stolen. That money will be returned in full, with interest. I'll give you 30 days to make that happen. They both nodded, not daring to argue. Second, you're going to tell me everything about these dangerous people you owe money to. Names, amounts, whatever leverage they have over you. I have contacts from my years investigating financial crimes. We're going to find a legitimate way to resolve your debts, one that doesn't involve further fraud. Vivian, you don't have to, Marcus began, but I cut him off. I'm not doing this for you, Marcus. I'm doing it because I won't have you getting yourself actually killed and leaving our son to grieve you all over again. Derek deserves better than that. He deserves better than both of you, I added, glancing at Claire. Finally, we're going to discuss what happens after all of this is resolved. Whether you stay dead or somehow resurface, what story we tell Derek, how we handle the legal implications. But those decisions will be made on my timeline, when I'm ready, not before. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. I'll expect your financial documentation within 48 hours. Email it to the secure server I'm about to give you credentials for. Don't try to run, don't try to hide anything. I will find it, and if I do, all bets are off and I go straight to the authorities with everything I have. Understood. They both nodded, looking shell-shocked. I felt a grim satisfaction in that. They'd spent 3 years controlling the narrative, manipulating everyone around them. Now they knew what it felt like to have someone else hold all the power. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt the weight of the last few days settling onto my shoulders. I'd uncovered the truth, confirmed my worst suspicions, and now faced an impossible series of decisions. How did you move forward when your husband faked his death? When your daughter-in-law betrayed you? When the life you've been rebuilding was based on an even bigger lie than the one you've been grieving? I didn't have answers yet, but I had something more important. I had the truth and I had control. Whatever came next, it would be on my terms. Not Marcus's, not Claire's. Mine. Sunday dinner was going to be very interesting indeed. The 48 hours before Sunday passed in a strange suspended state. I moved through my house like a ghost, unable to settle, unable to rest. Every surface held memories that now felt contaminated by knowledge. The wedding photo of Derek and Claire on the mantel seemed to mock me. The chair where Marcus used to read the newspaper each morning sat empty, and now I knew it had been empty by choice, not fate. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams where I was back at the funeral, but this time I could see Marcus watching from the crowd, always just out of reach when I tried to approach him. True to their word, or perhaps simply too terrified to do otherwise, Marcus and Claire sent the financial documentation within 36 hours. I spent Friday evening and most of Saturday analyzing the files, cross-referencing them against my own meticulous records. The scope of the theft was staggering once you saw it laid out in stark numbers. Over 3 years, they had siphoned nearly $400,000 from various accounts, investment portfolios, and the trust fund I'd established for future grandchildren. The amounts had been carefully calibrated to avoid triggering automatic alerts, never more than $5,000 at a time, often much less. It was sophisticated work, the kind that required insider knowledge of my financial habits and access to my accounts. What struck me most wasn't the amount, though that was substantial. It was the planning involved, the patience required to execute something this elaborate. Marcus had been plotting this for years before his supposed death, setting up the infrastructure, establishing the offshore accounts where the money eventually landed, creating false paper trails that would satisfy casual scrutiny. He'd done all of this while sleeping beside me, sharing meals with me, making love to me, all while constructing an exit strategy from our life together. I found myself wondering when exactly he'd made the decision. Was there a specific moment when he looked at me and thought, I need to escape this marriage, this life, even if it means letting her believe I'm dead? Or had it been gradual, a slow accumulation of resentment and fear until faking his death seemed like the only solution? The Marcus I thought I knew would never have been capable of such sustained deception. But then again, I was learning that the Marcus I thought I knew had never really existed at all. Saturday afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since before Marcus's supposed death. I called my oldest friend, Patricia Chun, and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee. Patricia and I had known each other for nearly 40 years, since our early days working at competing accounting firms in Seattle. She'd been the maid of honor at my wedding, had held my hand through my mother's death, had been one of the first people I called when Marcus died, or when I thought he died. We met at a small cafe near her house in the Pearl District. Patricia took one look at my face and immediately switched from pleasantries to concern. What's wrong? You look like you haven't slept in days. I hadn't planned to tell her everything. The situation was too complicated, too potentially explosive. But sitting across from my oldest friend, seeing genuine worry in her eyes, I found the words spilling out. I told her about finding the phone, about the surveillance, about confronting Marcus and Claire at the coffee shop. Patricia listened without interrupting, her expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and finally settling into a kind of grim determination. "What are you going to do?" she asked when I finished. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Part of me wants to call the police right now, have them both arrested for fraud and whatever other charges would apply. Another part of me wants to protect Derek from the truth as long as possible. He's been through so much already, grieving his father. How do I tell him it was all a lie?" Patricia reached across the table and took my hand. "Vivian, I've known you for 4 decades. I've watched you handle impossible situations with grace and strategic brilliance. You took down corporations engaged in systematic fraud. You've testified in federal court without flinching. You can handle this too. But you need to decide what outcome you actually want." "What do you mean?" "I mean, what does justice look like in this situation? Is it prison for Marcus and Claire? Is it financial restitution? Is it protecting Derek from the truth? Is it exposing everything to the light? You need to figure out what you want before Sunday dinner, because once that bomb goes off, you can't put it back together." She was right, of course. I'd been so focused on gathering evidence and controlling the situation that I hadn't thought through what I actually wanted the endgame to be. Did I want revenge? Closure? Justice? Protection for my son? Some combination of all of those things? "I keep thinking about Derek," I said slowly. "He genuinely loved his father, grieved him deeply. If I expose this, I'm not just revealing Marcus's crimes. I'm destroying Derek's memories of his dad, his entire understanding of his family history. Is it fair to do that to him? Is it fair to let him continue believing a lie?" Patricia countered gently. What happens if he finds out years from now that you knew and didn't tell him? How does that affect your relationship? I had no answer for that. Both options felt like betrayals in different ways. Tell Derek the truth and shatter his world. Keep the secret and become complicit in the deception. There was no clean path forward. No choice that didn't involve inflicting pain on someone I loved. What would you do? I asked Patricia. She considered for a long moment before answering. I'd tell him. Not because it's easy or kind, but because he deserves to make his own decisions about his relationships based on truth. Claire is his wife, Vivian. He's building a life with her, maybe planning children. He needs to know who he's really married to. The words hit me like a physical blow because they crystallized something I'd been avoiding. This wasn't just about Marcus's betrayal. It was about Claire's ongoing deception of Derek. Every day she woke up next to my son, smiled at him over breakfast, made plans for their future. She was lying by omission. She was allowing him to believe a fiction about his father's death that she knew was false. That might actually be the worst part of all of this, not what they'd done to me, but what they were continuing to do to Derek. You're right, I said finally. He needs to know. But I want to understand everything first. I want to know why Claire stayed involved after Marcus disappeared. What hold he has over her. I want to know if there's more to this than what they've told me so far. Patricia nodded approvingly. That's the forensic accountant I know. Always dig deeper, never accept the first explanation. So what's your plan for Sunday? I'm going to let dinner happen as scheduled, I said, the plan forming as I spoke. I'm going to watch them both, see how they interact with Derek, look for any signs he knows more than he's letting on. And then, at the right moment, I'm going to expose everything. I want Claire to have to face Derek with her lies. I want to see if she has any genuine remorse or if this has all been an act. That's cold, Vivian. Strategic, but cold. They faked a death and stole from me for 3 years, I replied, hearing the ice in my own voice. I think I'm entitled to a little coldness. We parted with a long hug, and Patricia made me promise to call her after Sunday dinner, no matter how late. As I drove home, I felt clearer than I had in days. I knew what I wanted now. I wanted the truth exposed, completely and without mercy. I wanted Derek to understand what had been done to him, to us. And I wanted Marcus and Claire to face real consequences for their actions. Not just financial restitution but genuine accountability. Sunday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. The weather was typical for Portland in autumn, overcast but not raining, the air crisp with the promise of winter. I spent the morning preparing for dinner, moving through familiar rituals that usually brought comfort. I made Marcus's favorite pot roast, the irony not lost on me. I set the table with the good china we'd received as wedding gifts 32 years ago. I even opened a bottle of the expensive wine Derek had given me for my birthday, the one I'd been saving for a special occasion. This definitely qualified, though not in the way I'd once imagined. At 4 o'clock, exactly on time, I heard Derek's key in the lock. He'd kept his key to my house since childhood, and I'd never asked for it back even after he married. The small gesture of trust now felt naive, though Derek had done nothing wrong. Or had he? I still wasn't entirely certain he was innocent in all of this. Marcus and Claire both insisted he knew nothing, but liars lie. I needed to see for myself. Mom! Derek's voice carried from the entryway, warm and familiar. Something smells incredible. I came out of the kitchen, wiping my hands on a dish towel, and took in the sight of my son. He looked good, healthy and happy in ways he hadn't been in the year following Marcus's death. His grief had been profound and genuine, I'd seen that clearly. He'd taken weeks off work, had barely been able to function. I remembered finding him sitting in Marcus's home office one afternoon, just sitting in his father's chair, crying silently. That grief couldn't have been faked, which meant he truly didn't know. The relief of that certainty was almost overwhelming. Whatever else happened tonight, my son was innocent. He was a victim in this just as much as I was. Claire followed Derek inside, carrying a bakery box that presumably contained the promised dessert. She looked pale, nervous, her eyes meeting mine briefly before darting away. Good. She should be nervous. I'd given her 48 hours to come clean to Derek herself, to tell him the truth before I did. The fact that she was here, playing the dutiful daughter-in-law, meant she'd chosen continued deception over honesty. That choice would cost her. "Hi, Mom," Claire said, her voice strained despite the casual words. She approached to give me the customary hug, and I let her, feeling her trembling slightly. "Thanks for having us again." "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, the endearment tasting like poison on my tongue. "You're always welcome here. Both of you." We moved into the living room, and I poured wine while Derek told me about his week at the architectural firm. A difficult client, a project that was coming together beautifully, the mundane details of a life that was about to be irrevocably changed. I watched Claire while he talked, saw how her hands shook slightly when she reached for her wine glass, how she kept glancing at me as if trying to gauge when I would make my move. "You seem quiet tonight, Claire," I observed, my tone light but pointed. "Everything all right?" "Just tired," she said quickly. "Work has been demanding lately." "I can imagine," I said. "All those meetings must be exhausting. The ones you have every Thursday afternoon, for instance." The color drained from Claire's face. Derek, oblivious to the undercurrent, just laughed. "Thursday afternoons? That's when you have your standing appointment with your therapist, right?" "Therapist?" I repeated, looking at Claire with raised eyebrows. "Is that what you've been telling Derek?" Claire's eyes went wide with panic. Derek's smile faded as he looked between us, confusion replacing his earlier cheerfulness. "What's going on? Mom, why are you acting strange?" I set down my wine glass with deliberate care. This was the moment. Once I spoke, there would be no going back. The truth would detonate like a bomb in the center of our family, and the fallout would reshape all of our lives. But Patricia had been right. Derek deserved the truth. He deserved to make his own choices based on reality, not the elaborate fiction that Marcus and Claire had constructed. "Derek, I need to tell you something." I began, my voice steady despite the chaos I was about to unleash. "And I need you to listen carefully without interrupting until I'm finished. Can you do that for me?" Something in my tone, in my expression, made him nod silently. He set down his own glass and gave me his full attention. Claire made a small sound, almost a whimper, and Derek glanced at her in confusion before looking back at me. "3 weeks ago, I was cleaning out your father's home office," I continued. "It's something I'd been putting off for a long time, as you know. I found an old phone of his tucked in a box. When I turned it on, there was a voicemail. A voicemail from your father, Derek. Dated 6 months ago." Derek's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Mom, that's not possible. Dad died 3 years ago. Maybe it was an old message that you hadn't heard before." "That's what I thought at first," I said. But the date stamp was clear. 6 months ago, long after the funeral, after the cremation, after all of us had supposedly laid him to rest. So I started investigating. I went through the phone records, the text messages, the calendar appointments. And do you know what I found? Derek shook his head, still not understanding where this was going. Claire had gone absolutely rigid. Her eyes locked on me with an expression caught between terror and resignation. "I found that your father has been alive this entire time," I said, each word precise and cutting. "He faked his death 3 years ago, and he's been living under a false identity in Eastern Oregon ever since. And the person who's been helping him, meeting with him regularly, facilitating the theft of nearly $400,000 from my accounts, is sitting right here in this room." Derek's head swung toward Claire so fast I heard his neck crack. "What? No, that's insane. Claire, tell her that's insane." Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, confirmation more damning than any confession could have been. "Tell him," I said quietly. "Tell your husband the truth, Claire. Tell him about your Thursday afternoon meetings at the Riverside roast. Tell him about the transfers you've been orchestrating. Tell him about helping Marcus fake his death certificate and arrange a fake cremation. Tell him everything. You've been meeting with my father?" Derek's voice had gone hollow with shock. "My dead father who isn't actually dead? Claire, what the hell is going on?" Claire's tears started then, but I felt no sympathy. She'd had days to come clean, multiple opportunities to tell Derek herself in private, with care. Instead, she'd chosen to maintain the lie until the very last moment, forcing this confrontation. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Derek, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I was helping." "Helping who?" Derek demanded, his voice rising. Helping my father fake his death? Helping steal from my mother? Helping me grieve for 3 years for someone who was alive? What part of that was helping anyone, Claire? I watched my son's face cycle through emotions, shock giving way to betrayal, confusion morphing into anger. This was what I'd wanted to protect him from, this exact moment of shattering realization. But Patricia had been right. He needed to know. He deserved to know. Let me fill in what she's not telling you, I said, pulling out the folder I'd prepared with copies of all the evidence. Bank statements with highlighted transfers. Photos of Marcus and Claire together at the coffee shop. Transcripts of conversations I'd recorded. The complete forensic timeline showing exactly when and how the money had been taken. I laid it all out on the coffee table in front of Derek like exhibits in a trial. Your father got involved in some kind of investment scheme about 7 years ago, I explained. It turned out to be money laundering, and when he tried to get out, the people running it came after him for money he owed. Rather than come to me, rather than trust his wife of nearly 3 decades to help him, he decided to fake his death. He recruited Claire to help him, told her I was having an affair and planning to divorce him, painted me as the villain so she'd feel justified in helping him disappear. Derek picked up the photos, his hands shaking. This is recent? These pictures. Last Tuesday, I confirmed. I followed Claire to their meeting spot and confronted them both. They've been meeting regularly for 3 years, Derek. Every week, sometimes more often. While you were working late, while you were grieving your father, your wife was helping him steal from me and maintain his new life. I didn't know he'd lied about your mom, Claire burst out desperately. Marcus told me she was having an affair, that she was going to leave him and take everything. He said he needed to protect himself. By the time I realized he'd lied, I was already in too deep. I'd helped file the fake death certificate, helped arrange everything. I didn't know how to get out. You get out by telling the truth, Derek shouted, standing up abruptly. You come clean, you face the consequences, you don't just keep lying for 3 years. How could you do this to me? To us? I was trying to protect you, Claire said weakly, but even she seemed to recognize how hollow that sounded. Protect me by lying to my face every single day? Derek's voice broke. By letting me believe my father was dead when you knew he was alive? By standing next to me at his funeral, holding my hand while I cried, all while knowing it was a complete fraud? That's not protection, Claire. That's betrayal. I'd never seen my son this angry. Even as a teenager, Derek had been relatively even-tempered, more likely to withdraw than explode. But now his face was flushed with rage, his whole body radiating fury and hurt. He looked at Claire like she was a stranger, and I supposed in many ways she was. The woman he'd married, the woman he thought he knew, had been hiding something this fundamental about herself for their entire marriage. Where is he? Derek demanded, turning to me. Where's Dad living? A town called Fossil in eastern Oregon, I replied. Small place, population less than 500. He's been working odd jobs, living under the name Michael Brennan. I have his address, his new phone number, everything. Derek pulled out his phone, his jaw set in a hard line. I'm calling him. Right now. Derek, wait, Claire pleaded, reaching for his arm. He jerked away from her touch like she'd burned him. Don't, he said sharply. Don't touch me. I don't even want to look at you right now. He walked out to the back porch to make the call, and Claire dissolved into sobs. I felt a moment of unwanted sympathy for her. She was young, only 28, and Marcus had manipulated her skillfully. But my sympathy was limited. At some point, everyone has to take responsibility for their own choices, and Claire had made a series of terrible ones. He's not going to forgive me, Claire said through her tears, looking at me with desperate hope that I might contradict her. Probably not, I agreed bluntly. Would you forgive him if the situation were reversed? If he'd lied to you about something this fundamental for your entire marriage? She had no answer for that. We sat in uncomfortable silence, listening to the muffled sound of Derek's voice from outside. The conversation seemed to be growing more heated, his tone rising and falling in waves of anger and anguish. When Derek finally came back inside, his face was streaked with tears. He looked at me, then at Claire, then back at me again. He admitted everything. Said he was sorry, said he never meant to hurt anyone. But he did hurt us, didn't he? He hurt all of us, and he did it deliberately. Yes, I said simply. He did. I told him I never want to see him again, Derek continued, his voice shaking. I told him he's dead to me now, for real this time. I told him if he ever tries to contact me or Mom or anyone in our family, I'll go to the police myself and make sure he goes to prison for fraud. I felt a complex mix of emotions at that. Pride in Derek's integrity, grief for the relationship he'd lost with his father, relief that he'd chosen to stand with me rather than Marcus, but also sadness for the finality of it all. Whatever Marcus and Derek had once had, whatever genuine love had existed between father and son, was gone now, destroyed by lies and betrayal. Derek turned to Claire, and his expression hardened again. I want you out of the house. Tonight. Pack your things and go stay with your parents or a friend, I don't care where. But I can't be under the same roof with you right now. Derek, please, Claire begged. Can't we at least talk about this? Go to counseling, try to work through it. Work through what? Derek asked incredulously. Work through you lying to me for our entire marriage? Work through you helping my father commit fraud and steal from my mother? Work through you letting me grieve for 3 years when you knew the truth the whole time? What exactly is there to work through, Claire? I made mistakes, but I love you, she said desperately. Doesn't that count for anything? Doesn't our marriage mean anything? I don't know if you even know what love means, Derek replied, and the cold finality in his voice made even me flinch. Real love is built on honesty and trust. We don't have either of those things. We probably never did. Claire looked at me one more time, perhaps hoping I'd intervene, ask Derek to calm down, suggest they take time before making any decisions. But I remained silent. This was between them now, and Derek had every right to his anger and his choices. I should go, Claire said finally, standing on shaky legs. She looked around the living room, at the dinner I'd prepared that now sat uneaten in the kitchen, at the wine glasses and the bakery box and all the trappings of the normal Sunday dinner that would never be normal again. I really am sorry, Vivian. For all of it. Sorry doesn't begin to address what you've done, I replied. But I appreciate you saying it anyway. After Claire left, Derek and I sat in silence for a long time. The pot roast was probably overcooked by now, but neither of us had any appetite. Finally Derek spoke, his voice small and broken in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child. Mom, how are you so calm about all of this? Dad faked his death, stole from you, let you grieve for 3 years. How are you not falling apart? I considered the question carefully before answering. I did fall apart, Derek. For the first few days after I found out, I could barely function. But then my training kicked in. I spent 30 years investigating fraud, documenting crimes, building cases. This isn't really different from any other case I worked, except that the criminals are people I loved. Is that how you see them? As criminals? They committed crimes, I said simply. Multiple felonies, actually. Identity fraud, theft, conspiracy. The fact that their family doesn't change what they did. Derek absorbed that, then asked the question I'd been dreading. Are you going to press charges? Turn them in to the police? I don't know yet, I admitted. Part of me wants to see them face real consequences for what they've done. But another part of me recognizes that would hurt you even more, drag our family through public scandal, make all of this even worse. I'm trying to figure out what justice looks like in a situation like this. What does Dad say? Is he going to try to make things right somehow? He's returning the money, I said. All of it with interest. I verified that the transfers have started. Beyond that, I don't know what making things right would even look like. You can't undo 3 years of lies and grief. Derek stood and walked to the mantel, picking up the framed photo of him and Marcus from his college graduation. In the picture, they both wore huge smiles, arms around each other, celebrating Derek's achievement. It had been one of Marcus's proudest days, I remembered. He told everyone who would listen about his son the architect, about how brilliant Derek was, how successful he'd become. Was any of it real? Derek asked, still looking at the photo. All those years, all those memories. Did he actually love me? Or was I just another person to manipulate? The question broke my heart. I think he loved you very much, I said honestly. I think that's the most complicated part of all of this, Derek. People aren't usually purely good or purely evil. Your father made terrible choices, committed serious crimes, hurt us both profoundly. But I also believe he genuinely loved you. Those things can both be true at the same time. I wish they couldn't, Derek said quietly. It would be easier if I could just hate him completely. But I can't. I'm so angry I can barely think straight, but underneath the anger I still love him. How messed up is that? It's not messed up at all, I assured him. It's human. Love doesn't just disappear because someone betrays you. Sometimes I think it would be easier if it did. We talked late into the night, working through the shock and anger and grief together. At some point I reheated the pot roast and we ate standing at the kitchen counter, not because we were hungry but because we needed something normal to do, some ritual to anchor us. Derek told me about his marriage, about small things he'd noticed over the years that made more sense now. Times when Claire had been evasive about her whereabouts, phone calls she'd taken in another room, a general sense of distance he'd attributed to normal marriage adjustment but now recognized as guilt and deception. Around midnight, Derek finally said he should go home, face the house that Claire had presumably vacated by now. I made him promise to call me when he got there, and he did, his voice hollow as he reported that Claire had taken a suitcase of clothes and her essential belongings, leaving a note on the kitchen counter apologizing again. After we hung up, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the ruins of what was supposed to be a normal Sunday dinner. The good china was still on the table, the wine bottle empty, the bakery box unopened. In the span of a few hours, I detonated my family's entire structure. Derek's marriage was almost certainly over. His relationship with his father was destroyed. And while my relationship with Derek remained intact, strengthened even by our shared trauma, I knew he would carry scars from this for the rest of his life. Had I done the right thing? I'd exposed the truth, yes, but at what cost? Marcus and Claire had both argued that their deception had been partly intended to protect Derek, to spare him the pain of knowing. Of course, that was self-serving justification for their crimes, but was there a kernel of truth in it? Was Derek better off knowing that his father had faked his death, or would he have been happier living with the lie? No, I decided firmly. Lies always catch up with you eventually. Better to face hard truths than build your life on false foundations. Derek was strong enough to handle this. It would hurt, it was hurting him right now, but he would survive and eventually rebuild. We both would. I cleaned up the kitchen, putting away the uneaten food, washing the china by hand as I always did with the good pieces. The mundane task was meditative, giving my hands something to do while my mind processed everything that had happened. Tomorrow I would need to make some hard decisions about next steps. Whether to pursue criminal charges, how to handle the social fallout when people learn the truth, what to tell friends and extended family who still believed Marcus was dead. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply feel the exhaustion of the day, the emotional toll of destroying and rebuilding in the span of a few hours. I'd spent 3 years as a widow, learning to navigate life alone, finding new purpose and identity separate from being Marcus's wife. Now I had to figure out who I was in this new reality where my husband was alive but dead to me by choice, where my daughter-in-law was no longer part of the family, where my son was wounded but standing beside me. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I paused at the wedding photo on the mantel, the one of Marcus and me on our wedding day 32 years ago. We'd been so young, so full of hope and plans and certainty about our future together. That couple in the photo had no idea what was coming, no inkling of the betrayals and lies that would eventually destroy what they were building. I picked up the frame and carried it upstairs with me. Tomorrow I'd decide what to do with it, whether to pack it away or throw it out or perhaps keep it as a reminder that things are rarely what they seem. But tonight I just needed to acknowledge the death of that young couple's dreams, to grieve not for Marcus as I'd been doing for 3 years, but for the marriage I thought we had and the man I thought he was. That grief, I suspected, would be much harder to process than the grief I'd felt when I thought he was dead. Death is final, clean in its own terrible way. But betrayal lingers, complicates, refuses to resolve neatly. I was going to have to learn to live with ambiguity, with unanswered questions, with the knowledge that someone I trusted completely had been lying to me for years. As I finally climbed into bed, exhausted but strangely clear-headed, I made myself a promise. Whatever happened next, however this all resolved, I would not let Marcus's betrayal define the rest of my life. I'd already wasted 3 years grieving a fiction. I wouldn't waste any more time giving him power over my choices, my happiness, my future. The truth was out now, painful and complicated, but at least it was truth. And truth, however difficult, was always better than the most comfortable lie. The following weeks unfolded with a strange mixture of chaos and clarity. Derek filed for divorce within 10 days of the revelation, citing irreconcilable differences and fraud. Claire didn't contest it. She moved back to her parents' house in Salem and, according to mutual acquaintances, seemed to be unraveling under the weight of her choices. I felt no satisfaction in that news, only a dull acknowledgement that consequences had arrived as they inevitably do. Marcus kept his word about the financial restitution. Every penny stolen over 3 years was returned with the promised interest, transferred in systematic installments that I verified against my forensic timeline. He sent one letter, handwritten on plain paper, that arrived at my house on a Tuesday morning. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won out. The letter contained no excuses, no attempts at justification. Just a straightforward acknowledgement of what he'd done and the damage he'd caused. He wrote that he understood Derek never wanted to see him again, that he accepted that consequence. He asked nothing of me except that I not pursue criminal charges, not for his sake but because it would drag Derek through public scrutiny he didn't deserve. The letter ended with 3 words that felt both inadequate and sincere. I am sorry. I sat with that letter for days, reading it multiple times, searching for hidden meanings or manipulations. In the end, I decided he was probably telling the truth, at least as much truth as Marcus was capable of. He was sorry. Sorry he'd been caught. Sorry for the pain he'd caused. Sorry that his elaborate escape plan had collapsed. Whether that sorrow translated to genuine remorse or just regret over consequences, I couldn't say. Patricia came over one evening with takeout and wine, settling into my kitchen like she had countless times over 4 decades of friendship. We ate pad thai straight from the containers and talked through my options regarding criminal prosecution. The district attorney would probably take the case if you pushed for it, Patricia said, twirling noodles around her fork. Identity fraud, financial crimes, conspiracy. You have documentation that would make any prosecutor salivate. But, I prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. But it would be ugly. Public trial, media attention. Every detail of your marriage and Marcus's supposed death picked apart in court. Derek would have to testify. Claire would have to testify. Your financial records would become public. Is that what you want? I thought about Derek, who was already struggling to rebuild his life after his marriage imploded. I thought about the business I'd spent decades building. The professional reputation that would be tainted by association with such a sordid scandal. I thought about the simple, selfish desire to move forward, rather than spending years mired in legal proceedings. No, I said finally. I don't want that. I want the money back, which I'm getting. I want Marcus to face consequences, which he is in his own way by losing his son and his identity and having to live in some tiny town under a fake name. I want Claire out of Derek's life, which is happening. What would prison add except more pain for everyone involved? Patricia nodded slowly. So you're letting them walk away. I'm choosing peace over revenge, I corrected. There's a difference. Your call to make, Patricia said, raising her wine glass. For what it's worth, I think you're making the mature choice. Not the satisfying one maybe, but the wise one. We drank to that, to wisdom over satisfaction, to choosing healing over vindication. It felt like the right decision, though I knew I'd second-guess it periodically for years to come. That's the thing about major choices. They rarely feel entirely certain even when you're confident you're choosing correctly. Derek slowly returned to himself over the following months, though he was changed in fundamental ways. He threw himself into his architecture work with renewed intensity, staying late at the office, taking on challenging projects he might have avoided before. We had dinner together twice a week now, more often than we had even before the revelation. Sometimes we talked about what happened, processing new layers of understanding as they emerged. More often we talked about other things, building new memories untainted by Marcus's shadow. One evening, about 3 months after the disastrous Sunday dinner, Derek brought up something I'd been wondering about but hadn't asked. I saw Claire yesterday, he said, pushing pasta around his plate. Just by chance, ran into her at the grocery store. How was that? I asked carefully. Strange. She looked different, thinner, tired. She tried to apologize again, said she's been in therapy, working through why she made the choices she did. She asked if there was any chance we could talk, maybe try to understand what happened between us. What did you say? Derek set down his fork. I said no. Not because I hate her, but because I don't trust her anymore. Maybe that makes me unforgiving. Maybe I should be big enough to give her a chance to explain. But every time I think about her standing next to me at Dad's funeral, knowing the whole thing was a lie, I just can't get past it. You don't owe her forgiveness, I said firmly. Forgiveness isn't something you force before you're ready. Maybe someday you'll feel differently, maybe you won't. Either way is okay. Do you forgive Dad? Derek asked, looking at me with genuine curiosity. I considered the question honestly. I don't know yet. Some days I think I'm moving toward forgiveness, understanding that he was desperate and made terrible choices out of fear. Other days I'm angry all over again at the betrayal, at the 3 years he stole from me. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip, Derek. It's a process, and I'm somewhere in the middle of it. That's fair, Derek said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, I'm glad you told me the truth. Even though it hurt, even though it destroyed my marriage and changed how I see Dad forever. I needed to know. I'm glad too, I said, meaning it. Whatever pain the truth had caused, it was better than the alternative of continued deception. 6 months after everything came to light, I received another communication from Marcus. Not a letter this time, but a message passed through his lawyer. He was officially relinquishing any claim to our joint assets, signing away rights to the house, the remaining investments, everything. His new identity, Michael Brennan, had no connection to his past life. Marcus Caldwell was truly dead now, at least in legal terms. The lawyer's letter included one additional item, a small envelope addressed to me in Marcus's handwriting. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen before, taken at Derek's 5th birthday party. Marcus was holding our son, both of them laughing at something off camera. Pure joy captured in that frozen moment. On the back, Marcus had written, "This was real. Whatever else was lies, this love was always real." I studied that photograph for a long time, seeing my husband and son suspended in a moment of uncomplicated happiness. Marcus was right about one thing, that love had been real. The love he'd felt for Derek, the love I'd felt for him, the family we'd built together for 3 decades. The fact that Marcus had destroyed it all with his choices didn't retroactively erase those genuine moments. That understanding brought a kind of peace I hadn't expected. I could acknowledge the good parts of our marriage while still recognizing the betrayal that ended it. Both truths could exist simultaneously without canceling each other out. Marcus had been a loving father and a lying criminal. I had been a devoted wife and a woman deceived. Our marriage had been both real and based partly on illusions. Life, I was learning, rarely offered the clean narratives I'd once built my cases around. I put the photograph in a box with other family pictures, not displayed but not destroyed either. Someday Derek might want it, might find comfort in visual evidence that his father's love, however complicated by later actions, had once been pure and genuine. As spring arrived in Portland, bringing rain and cherry blossoms and the promise of renewal, I found myself thinking less about Marcus and more about what came next for me. I'd spent 3 years as a widow, then several months processing betrayal. Now I wanted something different. Not closure exactly, because some wounds never fully close, but forward momentum, new purpose, a reason to wake up each morning beyond simply surviving. I started consulting again, taking on select cases involving financial fraud, using my skills to help people who'd been deceived and stolen from. The work felt meaningful in ways it hadn't before, probably because I understood now what it felt like to be the victim rather than just the investigator. I joined Patricia's book club, traveled to Vancouver for a long weekend, adopted a rescue dog that Derek named Justice with unintentional irony. Life wasn't perfect or even entirely healed, but it was mine again. Not the life I'd planned, not the comfortable retirement I'd envisioned spending with Marcus. Something different, harder earned, more authentic. I'd survived the worst kind of betrayal and come through changed but intact. That felt like an accomplishment worth acknowledging. 1 year after finding the phone that shattered my reality, I stood in my kitchen making coffee. The same kitchen where I'd sat on the floor listening to Marcus's impossible voicemail. The memory felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. I'd sold this house with too many contaminated memories, and bought a smaller place with a view of the river. Fresh start in physical form. Derek was thriving, his architecture firm landing a major contract to design a sustainable housing development. He'd started dating someone new, carefully and with appropriate caution. We still had dinner twice a week, that ritual intact even as everything else transformed. He never asked about his father, and I never volunteered information about the few times Marcus's lawyer contacted me about administrative details. As for Marcus himself, I genuinely didn't know where he was or what he was doing beyond the basics his lawyer shared. Living somewhere as Michael Brennan, working odd jobs, existing in the shadow life he'd chosen over his real one. Sometimes I wondered if he regretted his choices, if he lay awake at night thinking about what he'd lost. Mostly I tried not to think about him at all. The phone call that had exposed everything, that casual voicemail left on a device he'd forgotten about, had been the catalyst for the hardest year of my life. But it had also been a strange gift, forcing me to confront truths I'd have been happier never knowing but needed to understand. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd realized, that I could survive betrayals I'd once thought would destroy me, that starting over at 68 wasn't just possible but potentially liberating. I poured my coffee and walked out to the small balcony overlooking the Willamette River, watching the morning light dance on the water. Somewhere out there, Marcus was drinking his own morning coffee, living his fabricated life. Claire was rebuilding in Salem, trying to make peace with her choices. Derek was in his office, sketching designs for buildings that would outlast all our dramas. And I was here, scarred but surviving, having chosen truth over comfortable lies and finding, to my surprise, that I preferred it this way. The story didn't have a neat ending because life rarely does. There were still hard days when anger resurfaced unexpectedly. Still moments when I questioned my decision not to pursue criminal charges. Still grief for the marriage I'd thought I had and the man I'd thought I'd known. But there was also relief, clarity, and the hard-won knowledge that I could trust my own judgment again after having it so profoundly shaken. As I stood there watching Portland wake up around me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The sense that my story wasn't over, that there were chapters yet to be written that had nothing to do with Marcus or betrayal or the ashes of a fraudulent death. Whatever came next would be mine to choose, built on truth rather than illusions, grounded in reality rather than elaborate deceptions. That felt like enough. After everything, it felt like more than enough. Felt like a beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.